changed, and Tony Kaye went out, Wakeman came in, Banks went out, Howe came in, Bruford went out. What's involved when a band is making changes like that? Is it really tough? Is it emotional? Bitter? What happens?
I don't know. We started in that era where it had started to become maybe a little more commonplace amongst some of the bands who were more involved in the jazz rock side than maybe Yes were, that it became more of an accepted thing that one might go and play with this band and then do something with him, and then there was that feeling was creeping in, like the Chick Coreas and the Returns Forever, those kind of people. But even though Yes was just a little ahead of the beginning of that era, where we were more initially based on the old idea of a group, like the group would always try to be the same personnel. That feeling was creeping in, and basically, we started off, with Tony Kaye and Peter Banks, and that was with Bill Bruford drumming and John singing and myself. And the first thing to change was Peter Banks. Now, in many ways, he was a bit of a pain in the arse, that guy, and most people actually thought so. He was very lazy, but sweet guy, but basically very lazy and didn't pull his weight. So that could be justified, I think. Of course, it was different when it came to change over from Tony, because that was when it was started. You saw the personal relationships creeping in, where Steve Howe had come in, and he was just real hard worker and trying real hard, and you saw that Tony wasn't working quite as hard, and then I took more the position of being a mediator and trying to, but Tony's everyone's mate, but at the same time, that there was a certain despondency from other people, more from John and Steve Howe. I think that Tony wasn't really doing his best, so in a way it had to change, and that wasn't a very happy situation. Of course, the saddest one of all for me personally was when Bill Bruford decided to leave and go and join King Crimson. Yeah, because he obviously, in his purist type mentality, which he has, he just kind of preferred the more intricate jazz kind of thing that they had got into, rather. And Yes had started having, FM hits and even AM hits.
Does a band, if they're a 4 or 5 year band, and that someone out there is a better player, guitar player, bass player, whatever it is it worth it to break up the chemistry of what you got going, or?
Well, no, you're right. Actually, it in essence, it wasn't a great move to probably to have got rid of Tony Kaye at that time. Got rid of is a bit strong. I mean, it's like it was a mutually agreed thing in a way, just because things had come to an impasse where the atmosphere wasn't that great, so something had to change. So it's certainly not ideal to do it, but sometimes it has to be done, I guess.
Were you the guy? Were you the hatchet guy?
I must admit, I was a bit more of the schemer at some points, and I left some of that up to John to do the actual walking in. I was a bit more peeking behind the door after having engineered it, which I'm not that proud of, actually.
When you and John got together,
yeah,
did you have any idea that this band was going to turn out the way it turned out? This whatever adjectives they call them.
Not really. I had an idea that we could be successful. I noticed that John was obviously a very hard-working sort of guy when I met him, and was prepared to sort of put a lot of effort into his work, and he wasn't so much into being a big party person or anything like that. So one felt that there was definitely a good ground for getting somewhere in there, And as time went on, of course, it's like an unveiling book. As times go on, everything starts changing anyway. But I always felt pretty confident that I'd be successful, actually.
How good musicians were you all, you and Rick and Steve? How would you rate yourselves?
I think timing was the point. I think at the time, we just happened to be those people who had a couple more extra fast notes, and we could just actually do a little bit more, because I guess we just practiced at our instruments.
Were you conscious of this kind of new thing that the Nice and the ELP were doing, and that you were?
Yeah, well, that was the era that we formed in very much. You know, the Nice at the Marquee was just prior to forming, and obviously I used to go and watch them, and you know, and then we sort of moulded out the Action. Do you remember them at all?
Yes.
A guy called Reggie King used to sing. They were a favourite band of mine. And this was still really before The Who had even made it in America. So The Who was still another one of my influences as well, you know, with their kind of aggressive sort of rock, you know. So I think in Yes there was definitely a combination of a hangover of The Who plus the musicality as well, you know.
There was nobody in the States doing that at all. Nobody doing it effectively anyhow, because we'd go to England 6-7 times a year and hear all these bands, but you guys were way out in front on that.
Yeah. Well, it's a bit of a ping pong situation, isn't it? The English and American music thing. It tends to, you know, somebody does it over there, and then it comes back, and somebody re-improves it or re-homogenizes it.
What got you into the music business?
Well, none of my family were musical, but it's just that when I was very young, just because of a friend of mine who lived on the block, whose father was a clarinet player, and so therefore they were a musical family, and we were of the same age, about 7 or 8 years old, and he just joined the local church choir, and because I was his mate, I just went along with him. And the most amazing, fortunate thing was that this little local church choir happened to get the guy straight from Cambridge University, who just was the guy destined for stardom in the English church thing, who actually was the guy who ended up at Charles and Di's wedding doing this. So we got the guy at 21 years old when I was 8, who was the guy who was just cutting through the whole thing and going to become the top guy. So he made our little local church thing, choir, in 5 years into the best choir in England. Which was a great lesson for me.
Did you play an instrument at all?
No,
just sing.
couldn't play at all. Just learnt music like that through English church music.
And then you decided that that's a career you wanted?
No, not at all, because you know that became very much part of my thing. I mean, it was to that point where you know eventually we ended up actually doing gigs, you know, which for a church choir was ridiculous. You know, we do radio shows and stuff like that, and start getting money for it, you know, which is quite unheard of, really. When I didn't think that could happen, but then so that whole teaching was that. Of course, then when I was about 14 and a half or something, I actually, you know, my voice broke, and I left that situation and went to regular school. And so, of course, I had all that musical knowledge, and I used to tell the choir master at school and everything which way to do things and which way to arrange things, because he was always asking me, because he knew I'd been one of the guys under this guy who was this superstar. And, you know, so that was present, but I wasn't sure at all, while I was still doing my academic studies and that, whether I had any ideas of being a lawyer or a doctor or I had no idea at all. Until it came to the age of 16, and it was 1964, and there were the Beatles, and there was I-16, and my friend, other friend, had got a guitar, and oh well, Chris, you're tall. Why don't you get a bass guitar? Okay. That was it. You got big hands, so you play the bass. You know? And it started off like that. And by the time I was 17, you know, I was pretty much in a year I was in local bands and doing it.
I asked Paul McCartney if he had any idea of how much impact they had on other young musicians who, because I've heard it now 40 times.
Yeah.
And then we heard the Beatles, and then like everything changed.
Yeah.
They really had that impact, didn't they?
They really did, yeah. Especially at my age, being 16 years old, I was just a total sucker for it, you know, and a total believer.
I guess it's hard if it's like when you guys were as powerhouse as you were, that frame of years in there, when one came right after another.
Yeah.
It's hard to understand how much impact you're having, I guess, isn't it?
You talking about Yes now?
Yes, I'm talking about Yes. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously it's following, you know, Yes's sort of style, and you know, with the Genesis follow on in that mold, and then obviously all the American bands like you know, Styx and people like that, who sort of homogenized the style of it and made it a little more commercial, well, a lot more commercial in many ways, and took some of the guts out of it too. But yeah, I know that Yes is a big influence, and in fact still is. You know, from our last album, where we kind of turned it around again and did something different again, that influenced another whole set of.
I want to ask you about that album, about coming back. But when Fragile and Close to the Edge, they were the two major albums hit, and you had these back to back. Does the band get the feeling that they got all the answers? It's never going to end, and it's.
I think John did at that point. I think that's why we did Tales from Topographic Oceans after that, because it was more his idea that really, whatever we did, we couldn't do anything wrong. But I'm not putting him down for that.
He admits this too. Yeah. John already. He says, yeah, it was a mistake.
It wasn't necessarily a mistake. No. It's just that he didn't weigh it up, and it didn't take enough time over the whole concept of it. You know, so it was a little bit. There was just a little bit too much of that. You know, from my point of view, of reading him, that he just was a little too carried away with the fact, oh, we're rolling now. Whatever we do is going to be great.
He had to be a strong personality to ride through you guys on this, or did you guys feel it was right while it was happening?
Well, John had become very Napoleonistic at this point in time. Being the short guy he is as well, you know, it sort of took on that role pretty easily. So it wasn't always easy between him and I either, you know. But we sort of managed to keep our distance when we weren't being too friendly, and you know, managed to survive it, I guess.
Do you think the criticism was fair? Because it got savaged pretty badly. And
oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely fair. I mean, yeah. At that time, I had been in the opposite camp to John, saying, well, "Yes, it's all very well. We did Close to the Edge, but you know," I said, I think we kind of got away with that a bit, because even though that was like as instant a hit, I said I think that was a lot to do with the success of Fragile, and we shouldn't just forget some of the other directions before we go totally spacey, you know. But it was hard for John to see any of that kind of argument at that time, and he just saw any kind of conversation like that as being a negative from somebody else. So fortunately,
after that, things did not turn out terrific for a while.
No,
it was this fallow period. That, it would seem from the outside, has got to be as difficult a thing to take at a young age. Because when you make it in the rock world, you really make it. I mean, there's everybody around. You want green limos, you got green limos. You want white ties, you got, especially back then, 70s. That was the absolute indulgence of all time.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, it isn't there. Nobody's coming around. What happens?
Well, strangely enough, that never really happened to Yes, because although chart-wise and record-wise, it would seem that we'd fucked up. In actual fact, our concert reputation was so strong that even at the time when we had albums like Relayer and Yesterday's and Tomato around, even though they weren't selling like in the same way that Fragile had, we could still come to a concert tour of the States and pretty well sell it out most everywhere. We had such a strong concert reputation, so we never really had a kind of a real fall like that. We had some difficult times financially because of the raised lifestyle, and then of course it wasn't coming in quite as fast, but we actually managed to survive it without too much kind of like the graph going down too low, you know.
When I was in London, one of the interviews I did was with a gentleman named Brian Lane.
Yes.
He any help during all the turmoil of this, or did he stay far away because there's all this soap opera going on in the band too?
Yeah, well, Brian, Brian is the best dinner date in the world, really. He's a guy whom you can go to dinner with him and he'll just bound to make you laugh at some point or other. But he was also very kind of, in Yes's career, for very fair weather management. As soon as there were problems, he really didn't quite know how to deal with that. He tended to have separate phone calls with everyone and have slightly different answers for everyone. So that he wasn't very good at handling it when there were problems. You know.
How do you go about every day creating and making music when this tension goes on and you guys have people dropping out, coming back into the band and so forth? It was as rough a
Is
saga.
is it any rougher than being a businessman in the corporate world of
Well,
music? I don't know.
it's that you get thrown together with a group. I think it was Ian Anderson telling me about when you go on the road. I mean, all you think about is you, because it's just the four of you or five of you, and you're all together all the time.
Yeah.
Then you're making a record. You got to go in there and battle it out. In business, you don't really have that. There's problems all the time.
Yeah.
Not so much internally. It seems it must be very difficult to create when all that goes on.
Well, sometimes it can add. Tension can add. It can help, but yeah, there are periods when obviously things weren't going as efficiently as they should have done.
You only make one solo album?
So far, yeah.
That was about 75, was it? Or 76? Yeah.
75. In fact, it was released the same week as Frampton Comes Alive.
Oh!
They were both there in Record World, right? My solo album and Frampton Comes Alive. Reviewed the same. I think I got one more star than he did. Great.
Why haven't you taken a shot again?
I'm going to do it next year. I'm very slow, you see. Fortunately, and this is not a boastful thing, I think that, and many people have said it to me, that one can listen to my 75 solo album now, and it appears very fresh and current. And I tend to be more happy about that kind of a result than in actually turning out stuff, some of which is bound to not be as relevant as the rest. I try to focus that, as apart from my overall concern with if I'm going to do a solo thing, it's really got to be justified to myself.
Since the mid-70s, the state of music in England has gone down and up again. What's your overview of what's been happening in England since a golden age there with all those great bands?
What's my overview of what's been happening to Yes?
Oh no, what's been happening to English music?
English music. Well, now the thing that's interesting, the dreaded punk era that that came in, that everyone thought, oh, it's all gone down so much. But in actual fact, that really only lasted a very short period of time. I mean, because out of that same era came a lot of very successful and solid bands like The Police, The Pretenders, and I can't think of, but there are quite a few others that really everyone thought, oh, they're all English punk. But in fact, there was a lot of good bands coming through that as well. It was just a shake-up, I think, that you have to have.
You admire some of these bands? You think are really terrific?
Absolutely. I think The Police were great. Really good.
What was the catalyst in getting this enormous hit back a year ago? It was bigger than anything you've ever had, actually.
Well, it's the only number one single we've ever had, or even close. Sure. That's quite a long story. In 1980, that was kind of like on the tail end of the Yes, of the 70s sort of era, when it had ended up that John had left the band at that time and Steve Howe had left the band, and so just through coincidence, Brian Lane had got the Buggles management, and that was the oddest combination that people could ever foresee, getting this rather bubblegum kind of video killed the radio star guys, and Trevor Horn and Jeff Downes into Yes. But there again, one of them sort of sang and one of them played keyboards, and they were in the office, and so I thought, well, why not give it a try? And Steve Howe and Alan White didn't really believe it was a great idea, but I persuaded them to sort of, well, let's give it a go and see what happens. And so we had the era, which was definitely very assorted. I mean, there actually were some great times during that musically, and there were some actually awful times as well. So it was a bit of an up and down for Yes's career, but we did still do at that time. We still were doing like 4 nights at Madison Square Garden, that just based on reputation, and sometimes it went down extremely well. But anyway, at the end of that year, 1980, that sort of came to it ends, and really, Steve Howe didn't believe that carrying on with Trevor Horn was a great idea. He was too inconsistent as a singer, so he went back to his producing, and Alan White and I kind of stayed together in order to do this project with Jimmy Page, which we were going to call XYZ, which was supposed to be X Yes Zeppelin. That time Bonham had died. Jimmy Page had been very shocked by this, and whatever his past reputation had been as being a bit of a spooky guy, it obviously hit him a lot, and he kind of actually became very clear and straight for a while, and that was the era, not trying to intimate that he wasn't straight, but we all know, he had his faults. That was the era that we got together and started making some music, and actually I believe that this was going to happen, and the idea was eventually to bring Robert Plant in, and as well, once we had these nice things to play to him, because obviously there was a distance between Jimmy and Robert after Robert's child had died as well, and stuff like that. However, that didn't happen. After a while, it started to become a bit too comfortable again for Jim, and I think, he tended to lose interest because, let's face it, the guy had 80 million in the bank anyway, and he couldn't spend enough every week, just out of his interest. That guy was very well set up, and Alan and I weren't quite so capable of being in the position of, oh, well, let's work next week then, as he was, So that era passed, and so Alan and I said, we made a single together that was released in England. Do you want to get that? We made a single together called Run with the Fox that got a lot of airplay. It was a kind of a Christmas single. I think it may have been released here, but probably not promoted.
Is that as yes?
No, it was just Alan White and I. You just called it Chris Squire and Alan White. And then that was released, but it didn't sort of become like a huge thing. So we were saying, well, what should we do now? Shall we carry on like in a Steely Danny type way and make records in the studios and bring people in, and just kind of make this studio type record, or shall we get back together and form a band, that's a proper band with equal partners and stuff like that? So we decided that, in retrospect, that we thought that was the healthiest thing to do. So that's when I'd sort of after going through a lot of different guitar players, I wanted to get a guitar player first. We ended up with Trevor Rabin, which was a great find. Even though I'd known about him for 3 or 4 years, in actual fact, the first cassette I'd ever been given of his work had been given to me 3 or 4 years ago by Brian Lane. When Brian was doing one of his, hey Chris, here's this guy, if Steve's not happening, here's Steve, here's his bass player.
But I'll always be there.
Yeah, right, exactly. So it's ironic really that because when I first heard this guy, I wasn't really interested because he just sounded like a lot of other things, but in actual fact, when I met him and Alan and I played with him, we really actually found a very strong combination there. So then I called Tony Kay, who was living here, and said, listen, would you like to rejoin Yes? Because I'd seen that the problems with having Rick Wakeman and Steve Howe, who are both very virtuoso and all capable of playing very fast, lots of notes, in a way I'd seen the downfall of that situation, and realised that now that I had a new guitarist who was very capable of also doing all that clever stuff, that it's much better idea to get a keyboard player who's more textural, less of a challenge, and more someone who could work together. And when Tony came in, it fitted perfectly too. So there were the four of us, Trevor, Tony Kay, Alan White and myself. And we started working on material that we were all writing and rehearsing real hard for about 9 months in London. And we built up a very strong repertoire of music, and we had various record companies coming down to look at the situation. There was a lot of very impressed producers and people. And eventually it just turned out that Trevor Horn came down one day and really got into the idea of actually wanting to produce us. As he then started to climb his rung of productions. He with the ABC and stuff like that, which I know wasn't so big here, but was making a big impression in England, and it felt right to me. So he spent all this time starting working on this album, and the band was going to be called Cinema. We went into the studio and we spent, probably about 6-7 months, and we got it all up to this point where we did a lot of very kind of clever things that we were all very happy with, and we didn't have the imposing structure that this is Yes, and so therefore you have to this is a follow-up Yes thing. This was a completely new band, and in a way it was more out in the cold. But it got to this point where Trevor Horn and I one day were talking, and we were just saying, it might be nice if we actually asked John to come and sing on a couple of the tracks or something, because there was a couple of tracks where we weren't sure about the vocal that was there, and so I put that to John, and he came to the studio and he heard all the stuff, and he loved it all so much, and he started singing over everything, and we had to hold him back and stuff, and so only during the last 3 weeks of the making of that album was John ever there.
Ooh. Wow.
And then, of course, after he'd been there for 2 of those weeks, Trevor Horn and I were sitting in the control room one morning listening to the stuff, and I said to him, look, if we're carrying on with this, we've got to change it back to Yes, because people are going to say, why equals Cinema? It's going to be stupid, because it was just, with John singing on things, and it sounded just like Yes.
You had changed management and...
Yeah, by then we were already with Lookout.
Yeah. And some other things.
Yeah.
How, was it were you surprised at the reaction to this record?
Well, I felt it was there. Ahmet came down a couple of times to the studio and laid a couple of heavies on me, like, it's up to you, Chris, to make sure this is a hit. And I went, what do you mean it's up to me? Just remember I told you that. See you next year, and it gets a little
No pressure.
No pressure. But fortunately, it went well, and so...
What's it feel like to have a #1 single record?
It was great. It was the greatest thing. It must have been a terrible shock to Sheldon Vogel, because already by then, of course, they'd been running down the Yes royalties to probably holding more back here and there. to really run it down slowly, and then all of a sudden there was all this coming in. It probably confused them to hell, I'm sure. That's a great feeling, that is, when they think you've been written off and then you come back suddenly. It shocks them.
That has to be marvelous when people think it's over, because there are very few cases. Chicago is maybe the only other band that went through a period of decline.
Yeah.
Where the records, I don't imagine you're as proud of some of those records that came
in between,
as you were with some others, and Chicago the same way. But here they are with the biggest records of their career now.
Yeah. Well, it says a lot for persevering, doesn't it?
Yeah. Not too many, though.
Oh no, it's very difficult to re-achieve a hit after, especially coming back even bigger.
Because you tried in '77, as I recall, you brought Wakeman back in the band.
Right.
But it kind of proves you can't go home again, I guess, sometimes.
In a way it proved that, yeah. That wasn't the change that I really was behind. It was more a general vote that was the thing. I personally I always thought Rick was a little too flippant, for dealing seriously with careers. He was such a funny man, and hard to pin him down. But it happened.
This time of your life, and with a lot of mileage behind you, how does it feel? Where's it going now?
Well, okay, so the last year we've been working on this new album. Yeah. Started in Italy, moved to London, and it's now back here, where in fact we started rehearsing it last summer. Is
Trevor producing this?
Well, that's the thing.
Yet more intrigue.
More intrigue, yeah. I probably with Tony Dimitriadis, who would like the idea as well, pushed for the idea of, well, it's silly to break up a team after what we did last time. A couple of the other guys in the band, Trevor hadn't treated so well on the last album, and justifiably they weren't really sure about wanting to work with him again, because he can be a bit of a mean, nasty person if you're that other kind of person who reacts to that side of him, which I don't. But So if that went down for a long time, is he going to do it? Is he not going to do it? Is he going to? So in the end, we decided it's okay then. Let's give it a shot. So, with him, and so that's when we went to this place in Italy, which is where Trevor didn't particularly want to go, but it was a bit like the balance off thing, because if we're going to have Trevor, I want to go and work at my mate's studio in Italy, and it'll be better for us because it's cheaper. Now I've known for 15 years you never go anywhere because it's cheaper, because it always ends up being more expensive. And true to form, of course, what happened? We went there. Trevor Horn came down. Obviously, was pulling a moody about this doesn't work very well, we've got better stuff than this at SARM, and that went on and on for weeks. And of course, although we did get stuff done because there was a general enthusiasm within the band, there was still this slight tension between Trevor and other members of the band. And so eventually we made this decision, okay, all right, let's move it back to London then. We'll take what we've got, and, we like the engineer there, as I said, so we're going to carry on with him. Okay, Trevor, we'll go back to your studio, as if that would solve anything. No, not really, because we got back there, and of course the engineer complained all the time about his studio, the one in London. So then the engineer got fired, and another engineer came in, and then he was just a bit of a new house engineer who was just doing what Trevor Horn told him, but didn't really have much flair of his own. So although things have been getting done, it's been a very slow process.
Is Trevor here?
Well, what happened then was that he had his new Frankie Goes to Hollywood record being done in the other studio by Steve Lipson, who's like his number 2 engineer at SARM. And he was really concentrating on us, but popping in there to listen to what was going on with that. And of course, as it got closer and closer to this Christmas that's coming, of course, Trevor's wife, Jill, running the ZTT thing, obviously kept saying to him, Trevor, you've got to just finish the Frankie thing now. It's our record company, our business, So at a certain point, we sat down and said, well, this is obviously what's going to happen. So as some of the band live here permanently, I said, well, let's go back to LA and we'll finish it there. And, if you can come over after you finished your Frankie stuff, fine. But in actual fact, what happened was we came back and started working with Paul de Villiers, who did the Mr. stuff, and in actual fact is our on-the-road sound guy, so he knows us all very well.
So it's all...
So we're finishing it with him, and it's going to be good.
Is everybody a little more mellow now? I mean, less likely to take offense at anything inside the band?
I would think so, yeah.
Nobody's as feisty as... not quite as feisty as they used to be. There's no point.
No, well, it's obviously as you get older, there's less of that uncontrolled aggression, I guess.
What would you like to be doing 5-10 years out when you're in your 40s and want to be on the road, like Jagger or some of those people?
I don't know, actually. You see, I'm very good at business, and I'm very good at production, and I'm very good at organising and stuff as well. But I think I don't know if I could devote my life to that entirely. I mean, I obviously really enjoy playing to people live. It's a great feeling, because of what you get back.
That's still a big priority for the band to get out there and.
Well, I think we just now have to take it an album at a time. See what was great about the last time we toured, in 1984, 85, was that because we'd had such success with the record, the vibes were so good, everyone was happy, we were selling out, making money, So, of course, then you're really happy to play. I'd hate to be on one of those tours where it was like, oh my God, everything was going. Yeah. I mean, I couldn't do that.
Yeah. So as long as it stays good, you just want to stay with it.
Yeah.
And the rest of the guys all pretty anchored in there now, you think?
I guess, yeah. I wouldn't like to see any more changes right now.
What would be the odds assume this album were a very big success again?
Yeah.
What would be the odds of going off into 1987's topographic election?
I don't say it's impossible, but there again, you see, as you know now, there's compartmentalisation of music going on now. If you want to make an album like that, you can make it for Wyndham Hill or something, if you want to make those kind of sounds. It's so much like that now. John can do his experimental stuff and sign some deal with an odd left field label if he wants to, and maybe that's a good thing.
But
I don't know about Yes.
for all intents and purposes, Yes is going to go along and be Yes and look for great songs. And
Yeah. We've got 3 songs on this album with love in the title. And we've never ever, on any Yes album to date, ever had a song with love in the title.
Any reason?
I don't know. No, I think it's just coincidence.
Any reason? A coincidence that there never was, or coincidence that there's 3 going on now?
The fact there never was, I think probably there may have been some, obviously, kind of here, I don't know, arty sort of orientation about earlier on to not to do songs like that. But I hadn't really thought about it until we were going through the songs we had for this new album and realised that there were 3 songs with love in the title. And it's very commercial too.
The 70s were not much time for a lot of love talk. There was a
No.
hard edge on it.
Very hard.
That's when you realized that Zeppelin and Tull and you guys and so many other bands came roaring through. I mean, really roaring through and shaking the foundation. There wasn't love, was not in the air.
No.
It was a much more romantic time now.
It was a very hard time to make it, actually, the 70s too. It was like we worked very hard, and probably, basically in an era where things weren't really going for, that kind of the good vibes. As you say, it was the harder edge type period. So, but I'm glad,
Well, thank you. I got some good stuff because I got John too.